continuously perpetuate.
If I can come to you first, Moazzam, of course many people say the world changed after 9/11, and British Muslims themselves would say their lives certainly changed. But as somebody who was directly impacted upon, words like Guantanamo Bay are in people's minds, but you had the reality of that. How have you come to terms with the legacy of 9/11?
Well, the legacy, we still live with it because, as we say, one of the reasons why I'm impacted by it is Guantanamo, and Guantanamo was directly instituted as a result of 9/11. We were told that those responsible would be taken there, would be tried, would be prosecuted, and so forth. Not one person to this day, 10 years later, has been convicted of anything to do with the reason why Guantanamo was set up in the first place, and that is 9/11. Hundreds of prisoners, thousands of interrogations, and yet nothing. What we have seen, in fact, is an open hypocrisy of British and American powers. We've seen how, for example, today you can see that the leader of the military forces in Libya, Abdul Hakim Bilhaj, is someone who says that he was rendered by the US, tortured in Thailand, and sent over to Gaddafi, where he was terribly abused. I went to Libya 2 months ago and met with former Guantanamo prisoners there who told me that they were being interrogated in prison under Gaddafi's nose by British and American intelligence agents. So this stuff was taking place already, and those of us who were in Guantanamo already knew, like, for example, the British Libyan former Guantanamo prisoner, who says that Libyan intelligence agents came to him while he was in Guantanamo and threatened him that if he doesn't cooperate, they will do to him what they did to his father, and that is to kill him. So these sorts of hypocrisies now, I think that they've come to the surface, and 10 years it's taken, but I think the whole of the British public and the world at large will start to see that this has never been about principles, it's simply been about interests. And interests change from time to place, as we've seen.
Would you agree this is not really about values, but about interests?
There is a strong element of that, Salma. What I try to set out at the beginning of my new book is a thought that occurred to me and colleagues in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. You know, the war on terror was not a given. The war on terror was a particular response. You know, to be honest, it often occurs to me that if Osama bin Laden and his key advisors could have constructed their ideal response to 9/11, that would have been pretty much the war on terror. Indeed, there is an Al-Qaeda spokesman who describes it as almost being too good to be true. And so that, you know, that spoke very, very loudly to people like myself who had been, you know, steeped in what we thought was good counter-terrorism, where you learned...
And this was in your previous life, as it were, as
yes.
a police officer, as part of the Muslim contact.
Yes, I mean, I would go into work every day at New Scotland Yard, and I would be surrounded by, you know, outstanding experience. And of course, we'd made mistakes over the years. I think that was one of our disappointments, that the Prime Minister then, Tony Blair, he didn't seem to have taken these some of these lessons from, you know, what is good counterterrorism, what is not so good counterterrorism. He seemed to have discarded that in favour of the war on terror. I mean, just very, very briefly to summarise it, and what I expand on in the book. But as a rule of thumb, the very best kind of counterterrorism, whoever's carrying out the bomb attacks, whoever it is, the best kind is the most narrowly focused on terrorist perpetrators, terrorist suspects. And you know, we did that actually, and this is not often remembered, but in 1993 I helped the FBI when they came to London to investigate the first attack on the World Trade Center. And you know, that first attack on the World Trade Center wasn't so far from bringing down at least one of the towers. And why was that investigation good? It was good because we followed the rule of law. It was a criminal investigation. There was no need to resort to military action, and even less need to resort to the kind of activity that Moazzam's described at Guantanamo Bay.
And of course, that's all presupposing that counter-terrorism was the real reason behind the war on terror. Muslims raised the issue that perhaps that was not the intention. Was it something bit more than that? For example, some people are asking if 9/11 hadn't happened, would we still have seen the invasion of Iraq? Perhaps another excuse would have been used. Is that a view that you would share, or do you think it's been very much a reaction to 9/11?
I think it allowed certain things to be set in motion which were on the table before, we might say. I think there's evidence that certain aspects of the American government at that time saw the 9/11 attacks as an excuse to go after Saddam Hussein in the way that we finally saw. And so I think there were wheels that were already in motion. But what 9/11 did, as far as I can see, and we argue in our book really, is to create an environment where all Muslims became suspect. You saw that in the phenomena where Muslims, high-profile Muslims, and also not so high-profile Muslims were called upon to distance themselves from the 9/11 attacks, as if they weren't, as Bob says, a criminal
Muslims
attack.
have to prove themselves publicly to say, we are not part of this. In the same way, white Christians don't have to come out to say we're not part of the Norwegian attack.
Absolutely. And I think you see in a whole range of media and also in political discourse coming out after the time, that tendency to homogenise Muslims, to call everyone to account, to prove, particularly Muslims in the diaspora in the West and in those countries, to prove that they belong, that they are like us, and that they don't harbour these terroristic impulses.
But of course, when 7/7 happened, it almost proved the point of homegrown terrorists and the threat of British Muslims within.
I think the intelligence services here said quite clearly that the likelihood of a terrorist attack in the UK had gone up significantly after the invasion of Iraq. I wasn't here at the time, I was sort of a little tied up. But the reality is, of course, if that's the case, if they said that to the government, then surely they should have thought that what does this invasion mean for us as a country? Where will it lead us to? And what parallel do we have in history? When we were involved in the occupation, for example, of Northern Ireland, as it was seen by many people in that region, what were the circumstances? What were the consequences? What were the result of Bloody Sunday, for example? What was the return, as it were, of British soldiers being involved in the abuses and the killing of Iraqi civilians and citizens and fighters? What was going to be the fallout from that? And of course, it didn't take rocket science to work out that something was going to happen, somebody was going to do something. It didn't matter how Islamically educated he was or not. It didn't matter how steeped in extremist ideology he was. You just simply needed to open your television, open the internet, and see images constantly of abuse. And if not, at least in Afghanistan, I remember in Afghanistan, for example, when we were evacuating, the cruise missiles were landing and carpet bombs of 1,500-pound daisy cutters, they call them euphemistically. They don't cut flowers and grass, they cut people.
Given that there was a huge political anger, and this was across all communities, not just Muslim communities, the demonstrations were very diverse. And of course, people who have been part of the decision to go into countries like Iraq have a vested interest in not talking about the political context. But having said that, don't you think there is still something to be said about some interpretations where people feel the response to this injustice is blowing themselves and other people up, and that is something that you can't hold other people responsible for. It's something the Muslim community has to be.
I had this discussion with the only person I ever met in Guantanamo who was a self-declared member of Al-Qaeda. He said that, look, in the West, people are not innocent because they are democratic governments, and therefore the people choose what governments do, and they are responsible for partly in what the foreign policies are. And I said, look, well, that's not the case, because what about the people who didn't vote for them? And also, most people, they vote on internal policy and not on foreign policy. They're mostly concerned about the roads, about houses, about school and stuff like that. And he started to think about it. But nonetheless, it doesn't detract from the fact that in Britain we've had a history of people responding with violence. The only difference is that these people blew themselves up. The argument you could say is that, well, had they done it and not blown themselves up, they could have been at large to come back and do it again, which is what the IRA used to do. And so I think we need to recognise that the intelligence services noted very, very clearly that something was about to happen in the UK. Why did they say that, and why did they come to that conclusion?
Bob, in your book and your articles, you clearly set out a very rational argument that actually, if you want to be smart in countering extremism, if you want to reduce it, here is a way to do it by not alienating the vast majority, by not, for example, saying the Muslim community is treating them all as a suspect community. But why is that narrative, not the mainstream one within the police